Hi there. This is reading Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert N. Pirsig, and this is Chapter 7. In Kingston, Phaedrus's boat had been a tethered home from which the dock and the harbor seemed like a local neighborhood. But here, out on the broad river, the neighborhood was gone, and that below-deck's home was just a storage area in which the chief concern was that things did not shift and crash when the boat heeled in the wind. Now above deck, his attention was given to sail shape and wind direction and river current, and to the chart on the deck beside him folded to correspond to landmarks and day beacons and the progression of red and green buoys showing the way to the ocean. The river was brown with silt, and there was lots of debris in it, but nothing he couldn't avoid. There was a nice running breeze, but it was gusting and shifting a little, probably from deflection by the river valley. He felt depressed that Rigel had really gotten to him. Someday, maybe, he would develop a thick enough skin to not get bothered by someone like that, but the day hadn't arrived yet. Somehow he'd gotten the idea that a sailboat provided isolation and peace and tranquility in which thoughts could proceed freely and calmly without outside interference. It never happened. A sailboat under way means one hazard after another, with little time to think about anything but its needs. And a sailboat at the dock is an irresistible magnet for every conversation-making passerby in sight. He'd gotten resigned to it, and Rigel, when he'd met him, was just one of the hundreds of here today and gone tomorrow people that cruising causes you to meet. Lila was in that class too, and there was a lot to be said for that kind of wandering life, where you never know who you would be tied up against or sleeping with the next night. What depressed him most was the stupid way he had let himself be set up for Rigel's attack. He had probably been invited to breakfast just to receive that little sermon. Now he'd brood for days and go over everything that was said and recycle every word over and over again and think of perfect answers that he should have said at the time. A small power boat approached, coming the other way. As they passed, the helmsman waved from inside the cabin, and Phaedrus waved back. The weather was turning out better than he thought it would. Yesterday's stiff north wind was dying, and warm southwesterlies would probably take over, which meant a few days of good weather. The river was broad here, and the current would be with him for most of the day. This would be a nice day if it hadn't been for that scene this morning. The feeling left was one of enormous confusion and weariness, a kind of back to the drawing board, back to square one feeling you get when you're thinking you're making great progress and then suddenly some question like this comes along and sets you back to where you started. He didn't even want to think about it. There are so many kinds of people like Rigel around, he thought, but the ones who go posing as moralists are the worst. Cost-free morals, full of great ways for others to improve without any expense to themselves. There's an ego thing in there too. They use the morals to make someone else look inferior, and that way look better themselves. It doesn't matter what the moral code is: religious morals, political morals, racist morals, capitalist morals, feminist morals, hippie morals, they're all the same. The moral codes change, but the meanness and the egotism stay the same. The trouble was, pure meanness didn't completely explain what happened this morning. Something else was going on. Why should Rigel be so concerned about morals at that early an hour in the morning? It just didn't scan right. Not for some yachtsman lawyer like that. Not in this century, anyway. Maybe back in 1880, some church deacon lawyer might have talked like that, but not now. All that stuff Rigel was referring to about sacred duties and home and family went out 50 years ago. That wasn't what Rigel was mad about. It didn't make sense for him to go running around sermonizing people on morals at 8 o'clock in the morning, on his vacation, for God's sake. It wasn't even Sunday. It was just bizarre. He was mad about something else. What he was trying to do was catch Phaedrus in that old trap of sexual morality. If Phaedrus answered that Lila had quality, then he would be saying sex was quality, which was not right. But if he said Lila had no quality, the next question was, why were you sleeping with her? That had to be the world's oldest guilt trap. If you didn't go for Lila, you're some kind of prissy old prude. If you did go for her, you were some kind of dirty old man. No matter what you did, you were guilty and should be ashamed of yourself. That trap's been around since the Garden of Eden, at least. A broad lawn rising back from the bluff above the water's edge led to a grove of trees that partly concealed a large Victorian fin de siècle mansion. The lawn had the same deserted look he'd seen yesterday, uninhabited. No children or animals played anywhere. He noticed again, as he had coming down here, how this old Hudson River valley looked like paintings of it made more than 100 years ago. The banks of the river were steep and heavily forested, giving the river a quiet and tranquil look. Things seemed to have been the same here for a long time. Since he entered the Erie Canal system, he'd noticed how things seemed older and more tired. Now that feeling was even more dominant. Hundreds of years ago, these old waterways were the only way to travel in this continent. For a while he had wondered why his boat always seemed to stop at the oldest part of the city it came to, and then he realized that small boats stopping right there was what got the city started in the first place. Now there's a sadness that attaches to these old river and lake ports that were once bustling and important before the railroads took over. This Hudson River and the Erie Canal system were the main shipping route to the Great Lakes in the west. Now there's almost nothing, just an occasional oil barge. The river is almost abandoned. A depression always came over him when he came east like this, but the oldness and abandonment weren't the only reasons for it. He was a Midwesterner, and he shared many of the prejudices of many Midwesterners against this region of the country. He didn't like the way everything gets more stratified here. The rich start looking richer, and the poor start looking poorer. What was worse, they looked as though they thought this was the way things ought to be. They had settled for this. There was no sign it was going to change. In a state like Minnesota or Wisconsin, you can be poor and still feel some sense of dignity if you work hard and live fairly cleanly and keep your eye on the future. But here in New York, it seemed when you're poor, you're just poor. And that means you're nobody. Really nobody. And if you're rich, you're really somebody. And that fact seemed to explain 95% of everything else that went on in this region. Maybe he was just noticing it more because he'd been thinking about Indians. Some of these differences are just urban-rural differences, and the East is more urban, but some of these differences reflected European values too. Every time he came this way, he could feel the people getting more formal and impersonal and crafty. Exploitative, European, and petty too, and ungenerous. Out west among the Indians, it's a standing joke that the chief is the poorest man in the tribe. Every time somebody needs something, he's the one they go to. And by the Indian code, the generosity of the frontier, he has to help them. Phaedrus didn't think you'd see much of that along the river. He could just imagine some strange riverboat man pulling up to the Astor's mansion and saying, "I just saw a light on, and I thought I'd stop in and say hello." He wouldn't get past the butler. They'd be horrified at his impertinence, yet in the West, they'd probably feel obligated to invite him in. It just got worse and worse around here. The rich got glitzier and glitzier, and the poor got scuzzier and scuzzier until you finally got to New York City. Homeless crazies hovering over ventilator grates while billionaires are escorted past them to their limousines, with each somehow accepting this as natural. Oddly, it's this valley that's the worst. If you cross into Vermont or Massachusetts, it starts to weaken. He didn't know how to explain that. Something historical, maybe. New England was settled by a completely different pattern of immigration. That was it. In the early days, New England was one big WASP family, staying put. But this valley was everybody on the move. Dutch, English, French, German, Irish, and the relations were often hostile. So right from there was this aggressive, exploitative atmosphere. Maybe they had just as much class distinction and exploitiveness in New England, maybe even more, but they muted it so as not to upset the family. Here they just flaunted it openly. That's what these castles on the Hudson were, an open flaunting of wealth. He supposed maybe some of Rigel's morality this morning was Eastern too. No, that wasn't it. It was something else. If he were a true Easterner, he would have kept quiet about it and increased his distance. Why did he want to get involved? He didn't have to. He was angry. The celebrity thing, maybe. Once you become a celebrity, it satisfies some people to try to tear you down, and there's not much you can do about it. Phaedrus hadn't seen any of that all summer, where someone suddenly jumps on you for no reason at all because they think you're a celebrity. Maybe that's what it was. In the past, when it occurred, it was usually at parties when someone had a few drinks in them. Never at breakfast. Usually you get a warning when they're all over you with praise. Then you know they've got some false image of you they're talking to. Rigel was that way in Oswego. But it had been so far back, Phaedrus had forgotten about it. That celebrity business is another whole phenomenon. It's related to Indian-European conflict of values. It's a particularly American phenomenon to catapult people suddenly into celebrity, lavish praise and wealth upon them, and then, at the moment they at last become convinced of their worth, try to destroy them. At their feet and then at their throat. He thought the reason was that in America you're supposed to be socially superior, like a European, and socially equal, like an Indian, at the same time. It doesn't matter that these goals are contradictory. So what you get is this tension, this business executive's tension, where you're the most relaxed, smiling, easygoing guy in the world, who is also absolutely killing himself to beat the competition and get ahead. Everybody wants their children to be valedictorians, but nobody is supposed to be better than anybody else. A kid who comes out somewhere near the bottom of his class is guilt-ridden, self-destructive, and he thinks, it's not fair. Everybody's equal. And then the celebrity, John Lennon, steps out to sign an autograph for him. That's the end of the celebrity, John Lennon. Spooky. Until you're the celebrity, you don't see how spooky it is. They love you for being what they want you to be, but hate you for being what they're not. There's always this two-faced relationship with celebrity, and you never know which face will appear next. That's how it was with Rigel. First he was smiling because he thought he was talking to some big shot, and that satisfies his European patterns, but now he's furious because he thinks the big shot is acting superior or something like that. The old Indians knew how to handle it. They just got rid of anything anybody wanted. They didn't own property. They dressed in rags, some of them. They kept it down, laid low, and let the aristocrats and egalitarians and sycophants and assassins all look on them as worthless. That way, they got a lot accomplished without all the celebrity grief. This boat was good for that. When you're moving along like this, on these old abandoned waterways, you can relate to people on a one-to-one basis, without all the celebrity business standing in between. Rigel was just a fluke. Some noises came from the cabin. Phaedrus wondered if something had broken loose. Then he remembered his passenger. She was probably getting dressed or something. There's no food in this boat, Lila's voice said. There's some down there somewhere, he answered. No, there isn't. Her face appeared in the hatchway. She looked belligerent. He'd better not tell her he'd already had breakfast. She looked different. Worse. Her hair wasn't combed. Her eyes were reddened and lined underneath. She looked a lot older than she did last night. You didn't search around enough, he said. Look in the icebox. Where is that? That huge wooden lid with a ring in it, by the post there. Her face disappeared again, and soon he heard some more noises of her rummaging. There's something near the bottom, it looks like, she said. There are 3 boxes of junk food and 1 jar of peanut butter. The jar is almost empty. That is all. No eggs, no bacon, no nothing. Well, we're underway now, he said. We have to use this current while it's with us, or we lose a whole day. Tonight we'll have a big meal. Tonight? Yeah, he said. He heard her mutter, peanut butter and junk food. Don't you have anything at all? Oh, wait a minute, she said. Here's half a bar of chocolate. And then he heard her say, ugh. What's the matter, he asked. There's something wrong with it. It tastes stale. How about some coffee? Do you have any coffee? Her voice sounded pleading. Yes, he said. Come on up and steer, and I'll go down to make some. As she rose from the hatchway, he saw that she wore a white t-shirt, skin-tight, with the word L-O-V-E printed in large red block letters. She saw him stare and said, summer clothes again, pretty good weather. He said, I bet you never expected yesterday it would be like this. I never know what's going to happen next, she answered. I thought I was going to have breakfast next. She moved to sit across from him. The 4 letters of L-O-V-E shifted around in provocative directions. Do you know how to steer one of these boats, he asked. Of course, she said. Then keep to the right of that red nun buoy up there. He pointed to make sure she saw it. Then he stood up, stepped out of the cockpit into the hatchway, and went below. He started to search through some storage bins for food. But after looking for a while, he saw she was right. There wasn't any food on this boat. He hadn't known his supplies were so low. He found a box of cheese crackers that looked about a third full. How about some cheese crackers and coffee, he said. No answer. He tried again. With peanut butter? Sort of a continental breakfast? After a while, her voice said, "All right." He unlocked the gimbals from the stove so that it leveled itself against the boat's heel. Then from the shelf, he brought out a propane torch to preheat the stove's kerosene burner. This burner was a real problem. It had delicate brass needle valves attached to doorknob-sized handles, which meant that one normal turn wrecked the whole mechanism. "How soon until we get somewhere?" Lila asked. "We can't stop," he said. "I told you. That would get us out of phase with the current, and we'd have to bucket around West Point." He wasn't sure if she knew this river flowed backwards twice a day. "Rigel says there are moorings at Nyack," he added, "and from there it's an easy sail into Manhattan. I want to keep that last distance short, leave some margins. There's no telling what's down there." With a match he lit the propane torch, and then directed the flame onto one side of the burner, so that it would become hot enough to vaporize the kerosene. These stoves could not burn kerosene liquid. They could only burn kerosene gas. "Is Richard going to be there?" Lila asked. "Where? Where we stop." "I doubt it," Phaedrus said. "In fact, I'm sure he isn't." When the burner was red hot from the propane torch, he turned its knob handle a crack. A hot blue flame took hold. Phaedrus shut off the propane torch and put it on a shelf where the hot tip couldn't touch anything. Then he filled a kettle of water from the galley sink and put it on top of the burner. Lila said, "How long have you known him?" "Who?" "Richard." "Too long," he said. "Why do you say that?" "I'd just like to be by myself," he said. "You're a loner, huh?" Lila said. "Just like me." He went up the ladder halfway and looked out to see if she was still on course. It was all right. "It must be nice to have a boat like this all your own," she said. "Nobody ever tells you what to do. You just move on." "Yeah," he said. It was the first time he'd ever seen her smile. "I'm sorry about breakfast," he said. "That was a working dock we were at. We were right next to the crane. We had to get off so they could use it." When the coffee was done, he brought it up and sat across from her and took the tiller. "This is nice," Lila said. "That last boat I was on was too crowded. Everybody was in everybody else's way." "That's not a problem here," he said. "Do you always sail alone?" he asked. "Sometimes alone, sometimes with friends." "You're married, aren't you?" "Separated." "I knew it," Lila said. "And not very long, either." "How do you know that?" "Because there isn't any food on this boat. Real bachelor men always cook. They don't have junk food in the icebox." "We'll have the biggest steak in town when we get to Nyack," he said. "Where's Nyack?" "It's just a little way from Manhattan, on the New Jersey side. From there, it's just a few miles." "Good," she said. "Do you know a lot of people in New York?" "Yes," she said, "lots." "Did you used to live there?" "Yes." "What did you do?" She glanced up at him for a second. "I used to work there." "Where?" "Lots of different jobs." "What did you do?" "Secretary," she said. "Oh," he said. That sort of exhausted that. He didn't want to hear about her typing. He tried to think of some other topic. He wasn't any good at small talk. Never was. Dusenberry should be here. This was like the reservation again. "Do you like New York?" he asked. "Yes." "Why?" "The people are so friendly." Was she being sarcastic? No, her expression didn't show it. It was just blank, like she'd never been to New York. "Where did you live?" he asked. "West 40th," she said. He waited for her to continue, but she didn't. That apparently was it. Real chatterbox. She was worse than the Indians. What a change from last night. No illumination today. Just this kind of dull face staring straight ahead, not looking at anything in particular. He watched her for a while. It certainly wasn't an evil face, though. Not low quality. You could see it as pretty if you wanted to. Her whole head is wide, he thought. Brachycephalic, a physical anthropologist would call it. A Saxon head, probably, judging from her name. A commoner's head, a medieval yeoman's head, good for cudgeling, with the lower lip ready to curl, but not evil. Her eyes were out of place somehow. Her whole face and body and style of talking and action were all tough and ready for anything, but those eyes when she looked right at you were something else, like some frightened child looking up from the bottom of a well. They didn't fit at all. This was a beautiful valley, spectacular valley. The day was great, but she wasn't even noticing it. He wondered why she had come sailing in the first place. He supposed all that breakup with those people on the previous boat was depressing her, but he didn't want to get into it. He asked, "How well do you get along with Richard Rigel?" She seemed a little startled. "What makes you think I don't get along with him?" she said. "Last night when you first came in the bar, He told you to shut the door, remember? And you slammed it and said, "Does that suit you?" I got the impression you knew each other and were both angry. I know him, Lila said. We know some of the same people. Well, why was he mad at you? He wasn't mad at me, he just talks that way. Why? I don't know, she said. She finally said, he's very moody. One moment he's very friendly and the next moment he acts like that. That's just the way he is. To know that much about him, she had to know him very well, Phaedrus thought. Obviously, she wasn't telling everything. But what she said certainly rang true. It explained Rigel's attack this morning in a way that had never occurred to him. Rigel was just cranky and quixotic and attacked people without any explanation. But something in him didn't buy that explanation either. There was a better one. He just hadn't heard it yet. All this didn't explain why Rigel was attacking her and why she seemed to defend him. Usually, when one person hates another, the feeling is mutual. How is Rigel regarded back in Rochester, he asked. How do you mean? Lila said. Do people like him? Yes, he's popular, Lila said. Even though he's moody and turns on people who haven't done anything to him? Lila frowned. Would you say he's a very moral person? Phaedrus continued. No, not particularly, Lila said, like anyone else. She looked really annoyed. Why are you asking all these questions? Why didn't you ask him? He's your friend, isn't he? Phaedrus answered. He seemed to act awfully stuffy and moral and preachy this morning, and I thought that if you knew him, you might be able to tell me why. Richard? He seemed to object to my being with you last night. When did you talk to him? This morning. We had some conversations before the boat got off. It's none of his business what I do, Lila said. Well, why should he make such a fuss? I told you, that's the way he gets sometimes. He's moody, and he likes to tell other people what to do. But you said he was not especially moral. Why would he pick on morals? I don't know. He gets it from his mother. He gets everything from his mother. That's the way he talks sometimes. But he doesn't really mean it. He's just moody. Well, what? A really angry glare came from Lila's blue eyes. Why do you want to know about him so much? She said. It sounds like you're trying to get something on him. I don't like your questions. I don't want to hear about it. I thought he was your friend. Her jaw clamped shut and her cheek muscles were tense. She turned away from him and stared down over the boat's bulwark at the passing water. A railroad train came along the shore, on its way to Albany, probably. There was a roar as it went by and then disappeared to the north. He hadn't even known that the track was there. What else hadn't he noticed? He had a feeling there were a lot of things. Secrets, Rigel had said. Forbidden things. This was the Atlantic seaboard starting up now. A whole other culture. Back from the shore stood another mansion, like the one Phaedrus had noticed earlier. This one was of gray stone, so bleak and oppressive it looked like a setting for some great historic tragedy. Another old Eastern robber baron, Phaedrus thought, or his descendants, or maybe their creditors. He studied the mansion for a while. It was set back above a huge lawn. Everything was in its place. All the leaves were raked and the grass was mowed. Even the trees were carefully spaced and carefully trimmed. It looked like the work of some obedient caretaker who had been at it patiently all his life. Lila got up and said she needed to wash. She looked angry, but Phaedrus didn't know exactly what to do about it. He told her how to pump the water to wash with, and she picked up the empty box of cheese crackers and her cup and stepped into the hatchway. Halfway down the ladder, she turned and said, "Give me your cup and I'll wash it." No expression. He gave her his cup and she disappeared. He kept looking back again at the mansion rising back of the trees as the boat moved away from it. It was huge and gray and shabby and somewhat frightening. They sure knew how to dominate the spirit. He picked up the binoculars for a closer look. Under one small grove of oak trees by the shore were empty white-painted chairs around a white table. From their curly-cued shapes, he guessed they were made of ornamental cast iron. Something about them seemed to convey the mood of the whole place. Brittle, cold, and uncomfortable. That was the Victorian spirit, a whole attitude toward life. Quality, they called it. European quality, full of status and protocol. It had the same feeling as Rigel's sermon this morning. The social pattern that created that sermon on morality was the one that created these mansions, and the one that created these mansions were the same. It wasn't just Eastern, it was Victorian. Phaedrus hadn't thought about that factor so much, but these mansions and lawns and ornamental iron furniture made it unmistakable. He remembered his graduate school advisor, white-haired Professor Alice Tyler at the beginning of her first lecture on the Victorians, saying, "This is the period of American history I just hate to teach." When asked why, she said, "It's so depressing." Victorians in America, she explained, were nouveau riche, who had no guidelines for what to do with all their sudden wealth and growth. What was depressing about them was their ugly gracelessness, the gracelessness of someone who has outgrown his own cords of self-regulation. They didn't know how to relate to money. That was their problem. It was partly the new post-Civil War Industrial Revolution. Fortunes were being made in steel, lumber, cattle, machinery, railroads, and land. Everywhere one looked, new innovations were creating fortunes where there was nothing before. Cheap labor was pouring in from Europe. No income taxes and no social codes really forced a sharing of the wealth. After scrambling for their lives to get it, they couldn't just give it away, and the whole thing became involuted. That's a good word, involuted, twisted in upon itself like the curves of their ornamental woodwork and the paisley patterns of their fabrics. Victorian men with beards, Victorian women with long, involuted dresses. You could see them walking among the trees, stiff, somber. It was all a pose. He remembered elderly Victorians who had been nice to him as a child. It was a niceness that set him on edge. They were trying to improve him. It was expected that he would benefit from their attention. The Victorians always took themselves seriously, and the thing they took most seriously of all was their code of morality, or virtue, as they liked to call it. The Victorian aristocrats knew what quality was and defined it very carefully for persons with a less fortunate upbringing than their own. He got an image of them standing back of Rigel's shoulder at breakfast this morning, endorsing every word Rigel said. They would have to. That superiority Rigel asserted this morning was exactly the pose they would have affected. You can duplicate it perfectly by pretending you're a king of some European country, preferably England or Germany. Your subjects are devoted and demanding of you. You must show respect to your own station in life. It is not permitted that your interpersonal feelings be publicly displayed. Your whole Victorian purpose in life is to capture and maintain that pose. The tormented children of the Victorians often spoke of their morality as Puritanism, but this really slanders the Puritans. The Puritans were never the gaudy, fraudulent, ornamental peacocks the Victorians were. Puritan moral codes were as simple and unadorned as their houses and clothes. And they had a certain beauty because in their early period, at least, the Puritans really believed in them. It wasn't from Puritans, but from contemporary Europeans that the Victorians got their moral inspiration. They thought they followed the highest English standards of morality, but the English morality they looked up to wasn't anything Shakespeare would have recognized. Like Victoria herself, it was more out of the German Romantic tradition than anything English. Smug posing was the essence of their style. That's what these mansions were: poses, turrets, and gingerbread, and ornamental cast iron. They did it to their bodies with bustles and corsets. They did it to their whole social and psychic lives with impossible proprieties of table manners and speech, and posture and sexual repression. Their paintings captured it perfectly: expressionless, mindless, cream-skinned ladies sitting around ancient Greek columns draped in ancient Greek robes, in perfect form and posture except for one breast hanging out, which no one noticed, presumably because they were so elevated and so pure. And they called it quality. For them, the pose was quality. Quality was the social corset, the ornamental cast iron. It was a quality of manners and egotism and suppression of human decency. When Victorians were being moral, kindness wasn't anywhere in sight. They approved whatever was socially fashionable and suppressed or ignored anything that was not. The period ended when, after having defined for all time what truth and virtue and quality are, the Victorians and their Edwardian successors sent an entire generation of children into the trenches of World War I on behalf of these ideals and murdered them for nothing. That war was a natural consequence of Victorian moral egotism. When it was over, the children who survived never got tired of laughing at Charlie Chaplin comedies of those elderly people with their silk hats and too many clothes and noses up in the air. Young people of the 20s read Hemingway, Dos Passos, and Fitzgerald, drank bootleg gin, danced tangos into the night, drove fast roadsters, made illicit love, called themselves a lost generation, and never wanted anything to remind them of Victorian morality again. Ornamental cast iron. If you hit it with a sledgehammer, it doesn't just bend, it shatters into ugly, coarse fragments. The intellectual social reforms of this country just shattered those Victorians. All that's left of them now is ugly fragments of their ornamental cast iron way of life, turning up in odd places, such as these mansions and in Rigel's talk this morning. Instead of improving the world forever with their high-flown moral codes, they did just the opposite, left the world a moral vacuum we're still living in. Rigel, too. When Rigel starts all that breakfast oratory about morals, he's just blowing hot air. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just trying to imitate a Victorian because he thinks it sounds good. Phaedrus had told Rigel he couldn't answer Rigel's question because it was too difficult, but that didn't mean it couldn't be done. It could be done, but not with direct answers. Clever, hip-shot answers have to come out of the culture you're living in, and the culture we're living in doesn't have any quick answer for Rigel. To answer him, you have to go all the way back to the fundamental meanings of what is meant by morality. And in this culture, there aren't any fundamental meanings of morality. There are only old traditional social and religious meanings. And these don't have any real intellectual base. They're just traditions. That's why Phaedrus got such a weary feeling from all this. All the way back to the beginning. That's where he had to go. Because quality is morality. Make no mistake about it. They're identical. And if quality is the primary reality of the world, then that means morality is also the primary reality of the world. The world is primarily a moral order, but it's a moral order that neither Rigel nor the posing Victorians had ever, in their wildest dreams, thought about or heard about.